Welcome to our online training course for the Microcare Geyser Controller. We'll be going through the installation of the Geyser Controller as well as the Thermistor along with our geyser here, and then Pierre a little bit later on will be looking at the Wi-Fi app and how to connect to it and set up your Geyser Controller. It's important before we start that you have access to the latest Microcare Geyser Controller manual, which is available on our website at microcare.co.za. So now that you've got your manual for the Microcare Geyser Controller, I want you to open up the manual to page 1. This will be past the index page, and we're going to look at some of the important safety requirements and instructions regarding installing the Geyser Controller. Now, installers need to be qualified electricians or technicians. All the information you need for installing this Geyser Controller is available here in the manual. And the monitoring and operation of this controller is in this manual information. It's important to understand that this Geyser Controller cannot be paralleled. So that means it's a one Geyser Controller per geyser, an element system. So please make sure that you are familiar with this manual, have read through the instructions and are ready to go before actually installing. And we do need you to follow the correct path of installation and the instructions given to make sure that it is done correctly. Please make sure to reduce any risk of electrical shock, that you disconnect all wiring before making any attempt to maintain or clean this unit. Turning off the Geyser Controller will not reduce this risk. It's important that you retain the load within the specified ratings that we supply for you in this installation manual. We're going to ask you to mount the controller vertically, preferably at eye sight, so that you can have access to it. Do not install it onto an inclined surface or any rugged surface. It needs to be a preferably nice clean cement wall and where there won't be any sunlight exposed onto the unit. We have given you quite a few instructions and illustrations in this manual to assist you in this regard. Now, this is a locally designed product. It is new technology. It doesn't require the plumbing that normally would be associated with solar geysers pumping water onto the roof. So this is standard panels, standard elements, standard geyser. All we are doing is simply supplying you with an alternative supply of energy to that geyser, and a very efficient one. I do want to mention, we'll get into the panels a bit later, but if you are going to use your own panels, ones that you've got in your area or that you've got in stock, please ensure that you fall within the correct wattage and voltage window for the unit to operate correctly. I'll move on to page 2 and 2.2. Some key features. This controller uses your standard thermal element. It's currently outperforming your typically plumbing solar thermal heaters, and because of that, it operates in inclement weather. It's easy to install. It's designed for a retrofit, so even if you have a current geyser installed and you want to upgrade it for solar, you don't need to change the element or the geyser. And there's no need then to replace any of that thermostat either. Because of this, it's got a low heat dissipation, it's got a very good efficiency, higher than 95% when solar is present. And you can also have the Eskom or municipality mains to override the system if you have low solar or you want hot water quicker. We do supply you with an accurate digital temperature control through the Thermistor, which we're going to indicate a bit later. And if you are not wanting to go the Wi-Fi module route, we will be able to supply you with an external timer. On the bottom of page 2, you will see a basic system installation showcasing the panels, the solar panel isolator, the geyser isolator, and how the Thermistor connects in. We move across to page 3, a diagram of the actual controller, and very importantly, the connector blocks where you will be connecting your panels, your Thermistor, the Eskom supply, and of course your Geyser Controller as well. You'll see at the bottom of page 3 in 3.2, these are the specific highlights and zooming in onto those connector blocks and where we're asking you to connect the various items. It's very important, if you've not worked with a connector block before, that you make sure that it is open or closed before you start inserting a cable. The correct thing is to open it completely if it's not already open, and then close the clasp over the connection. We will talk a little bit about bootlace ferrules, making sure you've got clean connection there within the Geyser Controller. I'll move over to page 4. Again, we've got a bottom view of the controller and the various glands where we were asking you to put the cables through to connect onto those connector blocks that we saw on page 3. There are internal LED indicators that will showcase various statuses, and those are all available at 3.4. But I want to turn your attention to 3.5. This is going to be really important that you have access to the Audible fault codes. So what is this? This is now the Geyser Controller notifying you if there's a problem. And the way that this is done And I must just mention, with the Wi-Fi app, it makes it a lot easier. But if you don't have the Wi-Fi app and you choose not to go that route, the Audible fault codes will be able to assist you. So if it's beeping 4 times, it's going to beep 4 times, beep, 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 beep. Then there'll be a short break, and then 4 times again. So when you're installing, look out for the break and count the beeps, and that's going to indicate to us what the fault is. 3.5 indicates the typical fault codes. We've seen often number 4, the element fail. This is typically when the thermistor has been incorrectly inserted into the geyser, and so we're not reading temperature correctly. Also number 11, the thermistor has failed, is a common one. These are indicators for us to see whether we have correctly connected the geyser controller. So please make sure you have your manual available, and of course our technicians and sales team can send this to you on WhatsApp as well. So important at the bottom of page 4, 3.5, the Audible fault codes. We move over to page number 5 and number 4, very important now, solar panel sizing, and you'll note that our 2 kilowatt element has a different power requirement to any 3 and 4 kilowatt element. I often get asked, can I do a 5 kilowatt element? Can I do a 1 kilowatt? Please make sure you touch base with our factory before you go ahead with those systems. This is primarily designed to work with a 2, 3 and 4 kilowatt element. Now for the 2 kilowatt element, the voltage window, that means the panels connected in series need to achieve this minimum voltage, which is 184 volts. If you get 174 volts, the unit will work, but it won't heat up the water sufficiently, maybe on a really good day. The max is 274 volts, and that wattage array is from 900 watts to 2000 watts. So an ideal scenario would be something like 900 watts and an open circuit voltage of 200 volts. The 3 and 4 kilowatt element, a little bit of a lower voltage requirement there, from 140 volts up to 274, and the same wattage on the panel. So you'll actually see that voltage plays such a crucial role in the functioning of this geyser controller. So please make sure that you consult with us just to get a bit of a guidance. We often find that installers use panels, but then they're under on the voltage, although they're hitting the wattage window. So please ensure that you've got your solar panel sizing correctly. They need to be either 2, 3 or 4 panels in series to obtain the voltage and wattage requirements. And then on to number 5, you'll see the geyser controller installation. A couple of guidelines for you there. Please install it indoors. Do not install it in the roof, merely for the reason that if the end user needs to get to the controller to switch it off in an emergency case, maybe something has happened on the roof, then they're going to have to climb in the roof to do that, where if it's available within the house, it's much easier to resolve the situation. It must be mounted in a vertical position. We recommend 2 meters off the floor, sort of eye level, so that you can have good interaction with it. If it's low down or high up, you're going to need ladders or lying down, which is not ideal. Find a suitable temperature resistant surface. We would request that ideally you connect it onto a cement wall. Do not mount it in a closed container, although we have had clients mounting it into closed containers, but then ventilation needs to be supplied. So the next point, unrestricted airflow is required for the controller to operate at optimal efficiency. And then you install it between the main DB and the double pole isolator that's currently at your geyser right now. And you'll see that in the diagram on the bottom of page 5. On to page 6, it's installing the PV geyser controller and the timer if you choose that route. I won't go through that, it's fairly simple. It's just giving you indications of making sure it's level and how to find the correct drill holes. On to page 7 is the connecting, for those of you who haven't been involved in solar panel installations, how to connect in series. And it's an indicator there of the positive and negative and how you connect the panels into one another. Please note though at the bottom, the solar panel DC isolator, or you may use a fuse, must be mounted as close as possible to the geyser controller within arm's reach. So again, don't have this mounted inside the roof. And then the last section to cover here before we look at the thermistor, some general wiring information. Please, we request that it's done by qualified personnel or a certified electrician. Familiarize yourself with the contents of this manual before you go ahead. Now, the DC array voltage applied must comply with the controller's specified input, and the voltage, as mentioned, must not exceed the open circuit voltage. Now, before commencing with the AC wiring of this controller, please ensure that everything is basically off. The AC double isolator, the geyser is off, the geyser isolator at the main DB is off, the controller is switched off, and that the solar panel isolator is all switched off. Please make sure your wiring is correctly sized and make sure that the connections go through the control wiring glads as is required by SANS. And as mentioned earlier, unscrewing the wiring terminals. Please make sure you unscrew the clasps totally before you put the connection in there and close it nice and cleanly over the connection. We do ask that when you are putting on these bootlace ferrules that you expose enough of the copper. We recommend 8 millimeters of copper to make sure that there's a good connection. For your solar connection, please make sure you don't use house wire, that you use the correct solar flex wiring, and that your bootlace ferrules are correctly terminated on the end for correct connection. This controller, in the warning at the bottom of page 8, reminds you that it's not designed for parallel operation with another controller. It is a 1 geyser controller per geyser solution. Do not connect the controller's AC output directly to another AC supplier. Do not connect the geyser controller to any other electrical device or equipment, and do not disconnect or connect any wiring to the controller when under load. Page 9 will give you the AC wiring connection, the connector blocks we've gone through a little bit earlier, and keeping everything off as you go through these connections. There's a nice diagram on the bottom of page 9 that shows you how to earth your solution, how to connect into the DB board, the earthing, and from your geyser controller heading up to the geyser as well. So everything is well marked here for you, and there shouldn't be any problems there. Page 10 then indicates the solar panel wiring. Just important to note that it is not reverse polarity protected, so please make sure that you're connecting the positive to the positive and the negative to the negative, otherwise the unit will be damaged. Please make sure that the polarity is correct before you actually connect it, and you can do that by testing it with your multimeter. Please make sure that the connection is correct and that it is in the off position at this point. We haven't switched anything on, we're simply making connections onto the system. If your solar fuse is connected, if you're using a big solar fuse, also keep the carriage open for this point until we are ready to actually switch everything on. And then you connect the positive wire from the solar panel array to the geyser controller positive PV connector, and the negative to the negative PV connector as indicated on page 10. A nice helpful diagram there for you. For those of you using the timer, have not gone for the Wi-Fi module route, an indication at the bottom of page 11 will show you how to connect the timer. Right, coming up next, we're going to look at this geyser and the thermistor and how to connect it when doing the installation. So here we have a typical geyser. I've removed the cover, the plate on the back, to expose the thermostat. I've removed it out. In the back of it we can see the temperature, which needs to be set at max. In this case it would be 70 degrees. Now the reason we're removing it is because we want to insert a temperature probe. Microcare supplies you with a temperature probe and 20 meters of cable. On the one end is where we actually connect into the geyser controller, the other end is this temperature probe. So we actually want the temperature probe in there to read temperature. So there's a few ways you can do it. One of them is, if you have space, to simply insert it all the way. As you can see, I've done it quite a bit with this temperature probe, and then we are going to install the thermostat above it, and then I can feel it going right to the end, and I can simply connect it in. Now there we go. Now I can check by using my multimeter to check the resistance here. We're looking for 10 kilo ohms, and then we know it is installed correctly. But you might not have enough roof space, and it might be a bit difficult to install. So another way of doing it is we supply you with a bit of heat resistant tape. And one thing you can do, a little bit tricky to do, but if you do it on the ground and not in the roof, it's much easier, is to actually make sure the probe is just sticking beyond the end of the thermostat, and then use this tape to actually secure the temperature probe. So there we go, we can see the temperature probe sticking beyond the end. Now this cable can't go anywhere, it's fixed. In fact, you can use some of this tape to secure this along the way, and then simply put the temperature probe in. I can push it through and I can connect it once again by simply using my multimeter to check that there are 10 kilo ohms of resistance to ensure that this thermostat is reading temperature correctly. And that's how we install the Microcare Geyser Controller thermostat. Right, now that we've looked at how to install the thermistor inside this thermostat, we're going to look at where that connection is actually going to. And you'll see everything that I've covered in this last section is on page 12 and 13 inside your manual. Very important that once you've made this connection that you actually test to see that you are getting some of the resistance at the end of its connection. Right, we're going to move across to page 15, and now we're getting ready to switch on the units. Now, just in terms of the settings, the Microcare Geyser Controller comes with default settings. The default size for the element on page 15, 9.1, is a 3 kilowatt element. Now, if you don't have a 3 kilowatt element, you're going to need to make a change. If you have the Wi-Fi module, which Pierre will chat through a bit later, then you will need to use the Wi-Fi module to make the change. But if you don't have it, you're going to need to use the dip switches inside the controller. So right now you are set up factory standard for a 3 kilowatt element. The default temperature on the DC temperature side is 60 degrees. Again, if you want to change that, you're going to need to do so with the dip switches. The DC temperature hysteresis and the settings there are 1, 2, 5, 7 or 10 degrees. We would request that you set it as 10 degrees, which is the default from the factory side. The AC temperature below DC, normally we request again 10 degrees difference for that, but you can set it up as you want and as per what your client's requirements are. But currently it is set up default 10 degrees, and there's the AC temperature hysteresis information as well. That is what the default settings are on page 15. So if you want to change those, you would need to do the dip switches, which we'll go through just now, or use the Wi-Fi module. I'll move over to page 16 and our checks that we are going to do now before starting up the unit. Very important. So please ensure that the geyser controller is still off at this moment, and that is with the toggle switch on the geyser controller. Again, make sure it's mounted vertically. Check that the input and output cables are secured. You shouldn't be able to move it all. Ensure that the correct polarity of the PV connections are in place, and ensure that the AC wiring is all secured. No loose cables at this point. Now, switch the geyser double pole isolator at the geyser to the on position. This is the isolator in the roof next to the geyser. Then switch the external DC PV disconnect switch onto the on switch. So this is now between that isolator I mentioned earlier and all the way to the geyser controller. Now, we've got a unit called the GC LCD. You see it listed here in the middle of page 16. This is sort of like an on-site multimeter. Installers, we request that they have one and keep it with them. This is not something to leave on site, and it's something that you plug in. It's a ribbon cable connection, and you'll see there on the controller where it gets plugged into on the page. Now that is to give you an indication of what's actually happening on the controller. So it's a nice little helpful tool. It's really affordable, and we recommend that if you're installing geyser controllers, that you have your own GC LCD and you keep it with you. Is this information on the Wi-Fi module? Yes, but at this stage we haven't even got that far. We haven't switched on. So having the GC LCD available now would be a really helpful tool for you. So the LCD is sold separately, and it's all about helping you to make sure that you're set up correctly. So 10.1, ensure the geyser controller on-off switch is still off at this point. We've only switched on the isolator and the separate DC disconnect switch. And if you look at the screen at the bottom of page 16, it says there, power off. This is a snapshot of the GC LCD. It will say power off, and the PV, you should be reading voltage there. If you're reading voltage there, then that's correct. So these are the things that you're looking for at the bottom of page 16 on that GC LCD. Number one, power off. Secondly, PV, 167 volts. That indicates the open circuit panel voltage. IDC plus indicates 0. That means there's no DC amps coming through, which is correct. And then we're looking for temperature. You should be picking up temperature now from the thermistor, which we showed you how to install. It'll say something like TGEY 0 and then a gap and then the temperature. In this case, I've indicated 40 degrees. You should be picking that up at this point before we've even switched on. Please just note there, the DC current must be 0 amps at this stage. Very, very important. All right, moving over to page 17. Now you're going to program all the settings as described in the section before. So if it's the default settings are incorrect, you are now going to need to go through the dip switches and set that up. Once you are ready to do this, you can now switch the geyser controller, the toggle switch at the bottom of the controller, into the on position. And straight away, what do I want you to do? Look at the GC LCD screen. That little multi-tool we've plugged in, and this is what you should be seeing. On PV. Remember before? It was AC. This is now PV, all right. That indicates the controller is switched on, and the solar, the PV, is now supplying the geyser. You should still be getting panel voltage, PV 141 volts, but now you should be getting some amps coming through. The IDC plus must indicate something. In this case, I've got you 74, and that's not 74 DC amps, that's 7.4 DC amps. All right, no space for a dot there, unfortunately. So there we go. You've now switched the controller on. You should be getting these readings. If you don't have these readings, we've got to backtrack now. This is where you should be if you've done everything correctly in the manual. Now switch the geyser circuit breaker at the main DB on. Program the programmable timer. If you're using the timer, not the Wi-Fi module, there's a section in the manual of how to do that. And then you can remove the GC LCD. It's the ribbon cable connection in the geyser controller. You can simply remove it. You can then refit the covering, clean up, and we are good to go. For those of you who want to use the dip switches, on page 18, you'll notice that the dip switches are all in the downward position, and that is 100% correct. What happens is we make a setting change, we save it, and then we remove it into the bottom position. This means that there can't be any problems down the line. So you'll see a diagram with a bank of the 8 dip switches, and either side of those switches are 2 buttons, and those are your saving buttons. So if you look at 11.1, to select a 3 kilowatt element, switch the controller on or off switch to the off position. So remember, you're making any changes with dip switches, toggle off. Then ensure all the dip switches are in the off position, which is all down. To set the element size for a 3 kilowatt, just remember that that is the default setting, but if you want to change it, you'll see the other settings. For a 2, 3, and 4 kilowatt, this is now step 3 on page 18. So you would move the dip switches to the correct element size. Then step 4, you would push one of those buttons until the buzzer beeps. When it beeps, it is saved. Once you've completed that and it's saved, you can move all the dip switches down as in number 5. Don't push anything, it's now in a safe position. And then of course, once you've done and made all those changes in the dip switches, you can switch the toggle back on and switch the geyser controller on as well. So that's how you make changes to the controller using the dip switches. On page 19, you'll see there's the settings, the dip switch settings for the various settings that you may want. The geyser element size, the DC temp, the DC temp hysteresis, the AC temp below DC, which we recommend, if you remember, was 10 degrees less preferably, and the AC temp hysteresis. And how to restore factory settings is an indication on page 19, 11.3. People often ask, what temperature should I set the geyser at? It's very important that the thermistor is set on the back of the geyser to maximum, and that is a toggle over here which you would have seen earlier on our thermostat installation. So it's important that it's set to max, and find out from your client what's the temperature they would want. We would recommend on the DC side something like 60 degrees, and then on the AC something like 55. And the reason for that is because we don't really want AC to have to warm up 59 to 60 degrees when you are setting the timer. That's a bit of a waste of energy. 55 is more than sufficient. So if it's looking with the timer or the Wi-Fi module, it checks temperature and it sees that it's 56 degrees, there's no need to switch ESCOM on for 4 degrees. So keep the AC down below the DC, something like 55 on the AC side and 60 degrees on the DC side. On page 20 is an indication for those of you who are using the timer. It's an off-the-shelf product. How to use it, it comes with its own instructions, but there's an indication on page 20. And for more detailed information on the GC LCD and some more of its menus and functions, you could find that information on page 21 and 22. Specifications for our geyser controller are on page 23. And then, of course, it's all about the Wi-Fi module, this exciting new product which makes it so much easier, both for the installer and the end user. So Pia's going to explain to us how the Wi-Fi module is set up and how it works.